Originally created to be an artificial bestie that you could chat with when your real friends weren't available, 6 years later, Hugging Face is the leading natural language processing, or NLP, startup, with more than 1,000 companies using Hugging Face in production, including Bing, Apple, and Monzo. Hugging Face has fostered a huge open source community that is an enticing hub for anyone working in deep learning. And while Hugging Face was initially mainly aimed at NLP, as of recently, it's expanding to machine learning more generally, including computer vision and reinforcement learning. Talking about growing and expanding, Hugging Face just recently announced they raised a $100 million Series C from, among others, Sequoia and Coatue. I'm so fortunate to have with me here today Clement Delangue, the CEO of Hugging Face, to talk about the company's mission, its models, and his views on the overall AI landscape. Welcome to the show, Clement. So wonderful to have you here with us.
So nice. It's so nice for the invitation. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's so nice to meet you because actually, many guests I've met many times before, but in our case, it's the first time we meet, and I'm so glad Richard Soker, our mutual friend, was able to connect us.
Yeah, it's exciting. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So maybe we'll start at a very high level. I know Hugging Face is a community favorite, and a lot of people know so much about Hugging Face already. But just to get started at the highest level, nevertheless. What is Hugging Face?
Yeah, so at Hugging Face, we believe that machine learning is becoming like the new way of building technology, right? It's this Andrej Karpathy, like software 1.0 versus software 2.0. And we've been lucky in this kind of like transition from software 1.0 to software 2.0 to become kind of like the most popular platform for companies, researchers to host their machine learning artifacts, which are like models and data sets, to be able to share them between the team members, to collaborate on them, to evaluate them, and then ultimately to use them in production, right? So a little bit what GitHub has been for software, right? Being this platform where people host code, collaborate on code. We've become kind of like a similar platform, but for machine learning.
And now, of course, machine learning gets used in many forms. Some people use APIs, just served models. Other people want to use the actual trained model itself and download the model. Other people want to maybe just have the data the model was trained on. And so where is Hugging Face in that spectrum?
The interesting thing that we've learned at Hugging Face is that the layer of abstraction that you want to pick not only depends on the type of company, but also on where you are in your machine learning lifecycle. In the sense that when you're starting building a new feature or a new workflow or a new product, you want to go for maybe like the simplest level of abstraction for you. So maybe you're going to start with like an API, right? Or like with even like a demo. So for example, on the Hugging Face platform, on all the models, you have a way to try and test the model right away without writing any single line of code. And so that's really good for like the start of your project when we want to test a new model, test a new use case, test a new feature. And then progressively, as you mature in your development of machine learning feature, then you want to have more control and you want to invest more resources, for example, to optimize for inference scale or latency on your own infrastructure. So that's when you progressively move to more extensible parts of our stack. And sometimes you're going to use our open source libraries, which have been amongst like the most popular libraries out there. So what we're seeing from customers, from companies, from users is that they usually move from different layers of abstractions depending on where they are in their machine learning journey in a way.
Now, one thing that I'm always curious about with open source companies like Hugging Face, you're hosting all these open source models, which means that somebody can just come on and download the model and start using it, right? Which is absolutely beautiful. And you can actually contribute models and see your models being used by others and so forth. But what does that mean for a company? If you are hosting these models, people come and take, then aren't you just putting it, where are you getting paid?
Yeah. So what's interesting for us is that if you look at the market, if you look at the startups, how they've been built, the open source model for startups have definitely been validated in the last decades. If you look at very successful companies, you can see like Monzo, you can see Elastic, you can see Confluent, who has been said by Andreessen Horowitz as being kind of like the fastest growing company in terms of revenue ever, based on an open source project. The thinking around it is by creating a lot of value for the ecosystem with open source. You can get a level of adoption that is very insane, right? So, like for example, for Hugging Face, we have over 10,000 companies using us now, who have shared over 100,000 models. Half of them being public for everyone to use. And so you get really unprecedented kind of adoption. And then part of this huge adoption, there's always kind of like a fraction of these companies that are using it that are willing to pay. And sometimes it's for additional enterprise features, right? For like the largest enterprise companies that are using your platform. Sometimes it's because they're using your platform so heavily and they're so dependent on your platform that they have some specific needs. And so what we learn from these successful open source companies is that it's definitely like viable for companies to have a very popular open source and generate enough revenue at the same time to be sustainable and to be very successful companies. And it's even more true for a case like ours, where we believe, for solving machine learning and kind of like democratizing machine learning, it's something that we can't do on our own as kind of like a closed source individual company. We want to take an approach where we are very collaborative, open, and everyone can have like contribute with us to achieve this massive kind of like milestone for humanity, which is the democratization of machine learning.
It's been certainly wonderful for all machine learning practitioners to have such a hub where you can go find all the models, and you don't necessarily have to train all the models yourself, which can be quite time consuming and so forth. There are also, as you said, companies using Hugging Face. And for what kind of things are they using Hugging Face? And would a consumer, maybe somebody not working in AI themselves, running to applications that they work with or run into somehow that are under the hood, actually powered by Hugging Face?
Yeah, it would be actually hard today for most people listening to this podcast to go one day without using some sort of feature that is powered by Hugging Face one way or another. Just because machine learning really made its way basically everywhere. It's easy to miss it if you're not paying attention. But it's been very impressive for the past few years. So some of the biggest kind of like use cases that everyone is using are things like search. Like now if you're using search, it's heavily machine learning powered. So Bing, for example, is a good example of a company that is using Hugging Face to make search better. If you're using autocomplete, for example, like on LinkedIn, when you have like the quick replies when you're messaging, Or for example, when you go on Gmail and you have like autocomplete, these are kind of like use cases that people are using all the time. When you're going on social networks, a lot of the newsfeed ranking, a lot of like the moderation, like information extraction, is powered by transformers. And now more and more, we're starting to see use cases outside of text for audio, for example, when you're using kind of like a video call platform that is going to transcribe your course or get information from your course. When you're using kind of like a computer vision, for example, we have a startup called Segment.ai that is using us to do video segmentation and image segmentation to do automatic annotation that is then used for other use cases. So it's very widespread now in a lot of like different use cases. What we're seeing in the industry and with companies is that machine learning is definitely becoming like the default way of building technology, right? It's almost like for the best in class companies, when they build a new feature, a new product, a new workflow, it's almost like they start with machine learning now. And if it doesn't work, they fall back to this almost like old school way of doing software, writing like a million lines of code, very rule based. So it's been very exciting to see.
Now, it turns out actually, Clem, that on the podcast, we haven't really had a guest who's done nearly as much work in natural language processing as you and Hugging Face have. And so I'd love to take the opportunity to kind of also zoom out from Hugging Face all the way to NLP. And I'm curious about your view on essentially, I mean, the last 5 years in natural language processing have been just crazy in terms of rate of progress, right? And you've been at the center of this with Hugging Face. Now, I realize Hugging Face is expanding much beyond NLP at this point, but you were at the center of this right when it started. And I'm really curious about, how you experienced this NLP crazy progression in the last 5 years, and where do you see this go?
Yeah, you're totally right. It's been really insane in NLP. It all kind of like basically started with the paper "Attention is All You Need" in 2017, and then BERT that came out a year later in 2018. And what this new generation of architecture, right, the transformer models, did is that they basically started to beat the state of the art on every single NLP tasks out there, and every single benchmark. And you started to see more and more pre-trained models appear, right? It started with BERT, but then you got, GPT, you got Roberta, you got T5, this whole new generation of models that not only proved to be more accurate for NLP, but also proved to be very easy for companies to use. And so it happened that just a few weeks after these models were released, company, thanks to Transformers, our open source library, thanks to the Hugging Face Hub, started to use that in production for their use cases. Like the ones I talked about, right? Like for search, for information extraction, for text classification. And really quickly you saw this loop between, like the models getting better, accuracy getting better, companies using them and seeing value from them and investing more into machine learning, into NLP to have better models. And it created kind of like this very positive loop that completely changed the NLP landscape and turned it from some sort of a niche, machine learning topic maybe 3-4 years ago to arguably the biggest machine learning domain today. And to the point that now transformer models that we've seen changing the NLP landscape are starting to make their way into other domains, right? Into speech, into vision, into reinforcement learning, and much more. So it's been a very, very fun moment to see. And it's been driven by mostly from what we've seen by open science, right? So scientists from all the best research labs really sharing research papers, and open source, right? So scientists sharing their models openly with the world. And I say that because today there is this trend where some labs are starting to do less and less open science and open source. So one kind of like remind that to everyone, because I think if we want to keep progressing as fast in the future, we have to make sure we understood that this progress has been brought by open source and open science.
Absolutely. It always keeps amazing me how open science is, especially anything in machine learning. There is so much sharing, even though you're right that there is now a bit of a trend of people not always open sourcing everything anymore, which I guess ties into a whole related trend that some training of these models sometimes cost millions of dollars, right? Like you to process all the data, train your model, millions of dollars, and then just putting it out there. I guess not everybody feels like after they paid a few $1 million to train their model to just put it out there for everybody else to just now have available for free.
Yeah, I mean, the beauty of these models is that they can be a bit heavy to train, but what they've been trained, and you get like a pre-trained model. This model can be used in a lot of different use cases without any retraining. Or when you want to kind of like do new tasks or new domains, or even sometimes new languages, what is called the fine tuning. So adapting this model for new tasks, new domain, new language, is much cheaper, right? That's the beauty of the underlying technique for it, which is called transfer learning, right? You basically go from a very large pre-training to very small fine tuning. So what's really interesting in the ecosystem is that even though like the initial training is costly, if you look at the ecosystem in general and the usage in general, it's actually pretty efficient for everyone to use these models compared to previous generations where you had to do a lot of training for each task, each domain, each language, each use case. So that's kind of like a first point. And on the second point, I think it's worth remembering that most of these very, very large trainings are done by big tech, right? Or very, very large companies with very big, obviously, funding revenue streams. And so even kind of like the multi-million-dollar training for them is very much kind of like a drop in the water. We all know how expensive like researchers and team members in machine learning are today. And so at the end of the day, if you take that all into account, I don't think it's much different, and the economics are much different than before. Because at the end of the day, the benefit of sharing, open sourcing your models usually end up much greater. Because by sharing your models openly, you get more visibility for it. You get the whole ecosystem who can work on, how do we make sure that we have the right level of control, of accountability, how we can work on systems to mitigate the bias of these models. You get better researchers, because researchers, they want to work at companies where they can contribute to the ecosystem and not just contribute to your single company. So these are all kind of like the logics that apply to science in general, right? And that's why science is based around publishing the papers, and machine learning being this kind of like science-driven topic. The same logics apply, right? So There's a big kind of like gap between maybe like the short-term financial thinking about models and not open sourcing them versus kind of like the more sustainable long-term thinking around that.
I like the way you think about this. One thing that's been on my mind for a long time, ever since I heard the story, is that Hugging Face didn't initially start as a open source hub for machine learning. It started as a chatbot, as a lot of people would think about it. So I'm really curious, take us back to 2016, when you decide to start this, at the time, chatbot company. What was going through your mind? And then how did that change into what it become today?
Yeah, when we started with Julien Chaumont and Thomas Wolf, Hugging Face, we were really excited about machine learning, right? We were like, okay, this is kind of like the future. This is super exciting. That's what we want to work on, and we almost kind of like started with the angle being like, okay, what's the most challenging thing we could be working on right now on machine learning? And we ended up on this kind of like idea of building kind of like a fun, entertaining, open domain conversational AI. You know what everyone has seen in sci-fi, you know, like her, like this dream of having a conversational AI who you could talk to about, you know, like the weather, about your friends, about romance, about the latest kind of like sports game and things like that. And so we were like, oh, that's really challenging. It looks like nobody is managing really to do it well. Siri, Alexa, they're very transactional, very productivity driven, not really fun, not really entertaining. All right, let's start with that. And that's what we did. We had a lot of fun for like almost 2 years. And we kind of were lucky, I think, as sometimes startups are, in the fact that to do what we wanted to do initially well, to do like open domain conversational AI, we had to think about how to do a lot of different machine learning tasks, right? We wanted to be able to obviously extract information from text. We wanted to understand the intent from the text. We wanted to understand the sentiment. We wanted to be able to generate text to reply. We wanted to receive like images from the conversation, and so detect kind of like objects in images. And we wanted to handle so many different topics that we needed to handle a lot of different data sets, right? Like a sports data set to talk about sport, or weather data set to talk about weather. And so we ended up like building this platform to handle a lot of different models, a lot of different data sets, and almost kind of like randomly, because we always had this vision of like contributing to the community. We started open sourcing parts of that. And just right from the get-go, the interest from people was kind of like insane. People started to contribute. Open source contributors came in. Companies started using it. And so we got this kind of like huge adoption validation that kind of like led us to think, wow, this is like so much value that we're creating there. We don't really know what it is exactly yet, but there's so much interest from people that there must be something. And so in a matter of a couple of months, we basically went from this kind of like initial thing that we were working on to focusing on building a machine learning platform. And we've never looked back. It was probably like the best decision of the company's life to make this transition. And we're super happy about it.
And now that's so interesting, because it could also be that thanks to the Hugging Face platform that it becomes a lot easier for you or anybody else in the future to build that chatbot that you were targeting, right?
Yeah, and we do have a lot of conversational AI companies using the Hugging Face platform now. Siri, Alexa are using us, for example. So yeah, maybe at some point someone is going to be able to build our initial vision using the Hugging Face platform, and it's going to be like a fun cycle for sure.
And at the core, of course, is, as I understand, part of where it started was the Hugging Face transformer. And I'm curious, when in 2017, the paper came out, the transformer paper, Attention is All You Need, arguably the biggest change in AI since the AlexNet ImageNet breakthrough from Jeff Hinton and his students. How did you experience that? Like, how did you just see that this is actually really important and then decide to implement and open source that model?
Yeah. So we were already kind of like excited by some kind of like some kind of like things that built some foundations for that before. And so we were following really closely what was happening there. For example, Jeremy Howard, Sebastian Ruder were already doing some fun stuff on kind of like representation learning there. And so we were really close to what was happening. And then when we saw the paper, when we started playing with birds, we were like really mind blown, right? And kind of like started building thanks to that. And really quickly, just the fact that people started adopting it gave us even more like confidence that it could be like massively impactful.
Now, one of the things that really fascinates me about transformer models, and you, I think, see this closer up, so I'm very curious about your perception, is they seem more general than previous models. And we know that the brain is fairly general. If somebody, let's say, is blind, they might use the part of the brain that's usually used for seeing for other things, right? There's this kind of more general purpose fabric somehow in the brain, definitely more general purpose than anything we have today in artificial neural nets, but it seems like transformers get a lot closer to that. And I'm curious if you're seeing that in the code and how much code sharing is possible now between different problems, even different domains. And is there still code being shared in great detail?
Yeah, that's one of the main property of transfer learning, right? Which is at the basis of transformer models. And that's kind of like, to me, the most exciting development in machine learning, because as you said, it allows you to generalize to more tasks at the beginning within NLP, within text, but now on most of the other modalities, right? So we're starting to see more and more multimodal models, right? Text plus image, for example, like Clip and DALL-E that we've seen, but also audio plus text, and we believe that there's going to be more and more of this differentiation between all the different modalities that is going to get blurrier and blurrier. There's a good thread from Andrej Karpathy explaining how the difference between the different modalities are getting slimmer. I believe that in 3 years we won't even talk about different modalities. We won't talk about computer vision, NLP, speech. We will just talk about transformers and transfer learning and maybe machine learning in general. It won't even make sense to differentiate the different modalities. It's just going to be like different kind of like inputs in a way in the models, and that's what allows like different things to happen. First, it allows kind of like more community members in the science community to collaborate on similar topics. So it makes kind of like progress faster. And then it allows also companies to use the same kind of abstraction, for example, to use the Hugging Face Hub with different features, different workflows, without having to reinvent the wheel and create completely different systems. So it makes it like much easier for companies to build a lot of different features using the same abstractions. So we've seen a lot of companies, for example, starting with a very simple feature. Maybe they start with like information extraction to detect some things in some text that they have. And then they do that well. And because it's the same kind of models to do text classification, they do that next. And then after that, they will do kind of like autocomplete. And then they'll add some kind of like image classification features. And so it gives some sort of like consistency to the way companies also can build machine learning features, which participates in this democratization of machine learning for companies, I feel like.
So that's the user perspective. Somebody comes and sometimes leverages, takes advantage of everything available on Hugging Face or pieces available on Hugging Face for their application. Now, one thing that I think also plays a big role is the other way around. If you are a AI researcher, developer, if you build a good model, you can put it on Hugging Face and have tremendous impact with your contribution. How did you start building that side of the community, and what are some of the exciting things you see happening there right now?
Yeah, it's been very organic, right? At Hugging Face, we're very community driven. So the way we build a product is just asking people what they want, and in that case, asking researchers what they want, and kind of like build that. So initially, what researchers wanted was just like an easy way to host their weights, right? And so we built that. And then, they were like, okay, that's really nice to have our weights hosted. But now, I have team members, or I have kind of like the public who wants to test these models and who are not maybe, scientists. And so it's hard for them to run them. And so we started building the ability to demo your models, to test your models on these pages. For example, with something called Gradio, which is like a machine learning demo tool in Python. And then some scientists were like, okay, that's nice, but how do I communicate about like the biases or the limitations of my models? And that's when we started implementing the model cards, right, that have been invented by Meg Mitchell and Dr. Margaret Mitchell, who actually joined us a few months later from Google. For researchers to be able to communicate properly about how other companies can use or not use their models. So it's been a very kind of like iterative process like that with scientists, right? And I encourage, obviously, if there are like some scientists listening to this and they're struggling to do some things with their models. Just kind of like tweet at Hugging Face, to tell us like what they're struggling with, and we'd be happy to kind of like integrate that, add that as a functionality in the platform, because that's always how it's been kind of like working very community driven.
Talk about community driven. I gotta ask, as a reinforcement learning researcher, I saw you recently integrated the decision transformer into the Hugging Face library.
Yeah.
Any more general plans in the reinforcement learning direction?
Yeah, we're seeing like reinforcement learning as very important domain that we really want to invest more and more in. We're super excited about, decision transformers, obviously, because it's adding kind of like transformers into the mix. And we're seeing kind of like reinforcement learning being part of more and more of like machine learning workflows, even when it's not the only kind of like machine learning kind of like types of models that are used, but even kind of like in complement, in addition to other models. So it's super exciting to us. We have in the team someone called Tom Simonini, who's been doing like an amazing job on this. He's actually organizing an introduction to reinforcement learning course soon, to kind of like explain a little bit some of our initiatives there. So it's super exciting. We're super bullish on reinforcement learning, and we plan to do more and more in the coming months.
Well, I look forward to checking out the course and pointing more people to it. It's really exciting to see more resources on that front being put together. And of course, the other thing that I noticed is that I see more vision models emerge, because I think a year ago, at least I was thinking of Hugging Face as, the place for open source, NLP, everything's there. And then recently vision came into the mix also. Curious, what's your vision on that?
Yeah, we've seen like a really great adoption on speech and vision. I think now we're seeing 300,000 monthly downloads of speech models, and over 200,000 monthly downloads of vision models on the platform. So it's been super exciting, especially as transformers, like vision transformers, have started to kind of like beat some state of the art and be very successful on these topics. So the idea is to continue investing really heavily on these topics. We actually just closed a new round of funding, like a Series C of 100 million, and most of it is going to go towards more investments towards computer vision, speech, reinforcement learning, but also biology, chemistry. We're starting to see some usage in these other domains. And what I think in my mind is even more interesting is the intersection of all of them, right? So how can you use, speech with like NLP, with computer vision, adding kind of like reinforcement learning in the mix to do some alignment. So kind of like really trying to blend all these machine learning domains and see how we can do kind of like the traditional tasks better with better accuracy, and more easily for researchers and for companies, but also how you can create new use cases, and solve new problems that haven't been solved before.
So, well, congratulations on the recent C round, $100 million. That's a lot of funding available to start building a lot of new things. I imagine you're also hiring then at this time. Is that right?
Yeah, we hiring for like any position that you can think of. We have a little bit of a unusual way to hiring, in the sense that we don't really hire on very specific like job positions and job descriptions. Instead, we're kind of like finding really smart people who share our values, who are aligned with our culture, and then we bring them in, and then we assume that if they're excited about what we're doing, and if they're really amazing, they're gonna find their way to having an impact, almost no matter their position or like their job description. So it's been really fun. I mean, we went from 30 team members a little bit more than a year ago. Now we're 130 team members. Probably gonna end up the year at around 200 team members. It's probably been my greatest joy of the past 12 months of like scaling this team, um, based on our culture, based on our values, making sure that we really stick to them, and we build this organization that is like a little bit different than others, or unique, very kind of like decentralized, very open, very collaborative, very value inspired, value driven. Ethics is a very important topic for us. So it's been really fun, personally for me as a CEO, to be able to scale the team. Has been really amazing, and I'm really grateful to be able to do that even more in the future, thanks to this new round of funding.
Yeah, congratulations again. And it's definitely quite a different approach that you're describing to recruiting and hiring, where it's not driven by specific positions, but it's driven by values and sheer, I guess, abilities and excitement for people to join in the journey. I also noticed that you're actually located across multiple cities right now. How are you living that life? Where are you spending your time?
So we started the company. We were already in three countries from the get-go, because I was at the time in New York, Julien Chaumont was in Paris, and Thomas Wolff was in the Netherlands. So it's been fun to have that part of our culture from the get-go. Now we have a couple of like bigger offices in Paris and in New York. Then we have a bunch of smaller offices, like we have one in Palo Alto, for example. We have one in Switzerland. We have one in London. We have one in south of France. And I have a small one here in Miami, Florida, where I'm spending most of my time, but also spending a lot of time traveling to the other Hugging Face location. And also most of the people working at Hugging Face, like over 60% of the team, are just remote, everywhere, all over the world, working remote and then traveling to the offices to spend time with the team in person.
It sounds like you started this remote work before COVID. Is that right?
Yeah. We started we started remote like in 2016, and always had this culture of like decentralization that's working really well for remote. We have a strong kind of like asynchronous culture, a strong kind of like culture of transparency. Like most of the things at Hugging Face are either happening totally in the open, so like on Twitter, for example, or on massive kind of like Slack rooms. So all of these that we started pretty early on in the company's journey, they ended up being pretty useful and pretty helpful when COVID hit, and that we had even more constraints in terms of like going to an office.
Now, I'm actually curious. You mentioned the Series C earlier, right? Can you share something about the investors that led and are part of the Series C?
Yeah, so we have a mix of our existing investors who we've been working really well with. Some of them are Lux Capital, Edition, but also older investors. So, for example, if X with like Richard Socher, our mutual friends, as an investor, and we added to that Sequoia. And Kotu, which are both kind of like very renowned US investors who showed a lot of conviction to join us, and are going to bring especially some expertise around open source and community. For example, Sequoia, they've been the investor at GitHub, which is obviously a very big inspiration for us as kind of like a similar platform for typical software to what we're trying to do for machine learning. So we're super excited about that, doubling down on what we've been doing on the open source, on the community, make sure we have enough resources to really focus on the long term of what we're doing, and really keep investing again on the community, on the open source with that.
Well, congratulations. I think often with fundraising, a big part is the money. A big part is also bringing investors who really want to support the mission and ideally are very highly reputed themselves. And obviously you managed to check all the boxes in your fundraise. It's amazing.
Thank you.
So Clem, I really like the thing you bring up there, because very often when I talk with people who, let's say, work at OpenAI or Google, who are two companies who train some of the biggest models, I hear things like, "Oh, it turns out there are a lot of challenges in scaling up the training of these models. There's a lot of engineering, but also research-related challenges that you wouldn't really expect." But then I guess it's seen as private IP to understand how to deal with those challenges, because of course it's natural. They want to make a profit, I guess, and have an advantage. But your spirit is so different. You're saying, hey, our impact can be much bigger if we actually can somehow run a project that exposes everybody to those challenges and lessons learned and so forth. And so I imagine this paper or report is going to be very widely read, because until now, it's just in a few places where people really see the specific challenges that are encountered when running things at such large scale, training for weeks and weeks, possibly months, to get a model out. What does it take to do that successfully? I'm also curious because, I mean, since it's going to be the first run you're taking at it, I mean, it could be that you need to try this a few times before it actually succeeds, no?
The big science team already did a few runs, so we already have like smaller models.
Got it.
So it's really very much kind of like the last run of training that is happening now. It's happening. What's also interesting about the project is that it's happening thanks to INRIA in France and the Jean Zé supercomputer, which is one of the, I think, top 10 biggest supercomputers in the world. And it's happening, as you might know, most of the energy production in France is based on nuclear energy. So it's much more CO2 efficient than in some other countries. That's something we care a lot about at Hugging Face too. We have, like, part of the team, someone called Sasha Lucioni, who's working a lot on the environmental impact of machine learning. But so yeah, it's really interesting to follow the training, and follow. You have someone in the team called Stas that you can even follow on Twitter, and each time there's a problem happening, he's going to like tweet about it, and kind of like share on GitHub or on Hugging Face about what happened and how it got solved. So like the nitty gritty of the training also is super interesting, and it hasn't really been seen in the past, except if you are at one of these like big organizations that have trained a large model like that. It's really fascinating to follow. There's even like a big science training Twitter account that has now, I think, over 3,000 followers, that is tweeting about the progress every day. It's a very like mesmerizing thing to follow.
I'm going to start following that once I'm off this call.
Yeah. And just to also kind of like answer a little bit the first part of your comments, open sourcing and sharing publicly is really the result of a different mindset. If you start from thinking that the main competitive advantage of companies is not so much the technology that they have at given points, but more their ability to build technology faster than others, especially on such a fast-moving domain as machine learning, where you can be like outdated basically in 2 months. Then kind of like open sourcing, open science is actually a mean to that end, because by sharing publicly, involving the community, getting contribution for others, attracting the best scientists, you actually improve your ability to build technology faster than others. So even I think if you don't have this more like uh, will to contribute to the ecosystem, contribute to the community, I think as a company, it's just a smart decision to do that, because it increases your ability to stay ahead and stay at the cutting edge of what's happening. I think in machine learning, we've seen a lot of companies, especially, for example, enterprise AI companies, basically the companies that are doing the most revenue today in machine learning, who kind of like lost their technology edge and started not to be able to hire really like the best people in the domain. And it has been a big problem for them, because really fast you start working on like older school stuff, and you get outdated, and just your things are starting to work much less than more cutting edge stuff. So I think like open sourcing, open science, contributing to the community is really kind of like the smart way to stay ahead in machine learning, stay close to what's happening, and actually build up your capability as a company to build technology faster than others.
I really like that view on thing, that it's sometimes enabling you to move faster, because you have no choice anymore almost. And
it forces you, right? Because once you've released, you just like up to the next thing too. Yeah, that's very true.
Now, one thing I've been curious about for a while is, well, I'm personally a big basketball fan, and I noticed that you have Kevin Durant, one of the NBA basketball stars, on your investor team. So I'm really curious about the story behind that.
Yeah, it's a pretty funny story. I'm pretty convinced that being French and growing up not watching the NBA, when I met him, I barely knew who he was. So I really talked to him like he was like the average Joe. And I'm pretty convinced that's a big part why I decided to invest, because I wasn't this big like fanboy, being very impressed, very like sweating and stuff. I was like, hey man, so that's what we're doing. I didn't really care too much. And I think in some way he appreciated that. And I think it just like, I mean, without putting words in his mouth, I think he was excited about like the prospect of working on something very serious and very technical like machine learning, but with like a probably a less serious approach and less kind of like professional approach, like boring B2B approach than most of the companies, right? If at the end of the day our name is Hugging Face, our logo is an emoji. And so it's similar to his approach of doing something entertaining like the NBA, but he's very serious about it, but it's on something not serious. So there's some parallel there. Another funny story is that when he invested, he was playing for the Warriors. So as kind of like a professional duty, I started to root for the Warriors and become this huge Warriors fan. I even had my Warriors hats. You can ask people at the time, I was always wearing my Warriors hats, but living in New York. And then 2 years later, he decides to move to the Nets, literally 1 block away from where I live, because I was living in Fort Greene, just next to the Barclays Center. And then I was like in a conundrum. I was like, okay, what should I do now? Should I like switch teams? And people are going to tell me like, oh, you're switching to the better team. You're not a good fan. Or should I keep rooting for the Warriors while he was playing literally a block away from me, in my kind of like, not home team, but kind of like where I was living, a living team. So at that time, I decided, okay, the best answer to this challenge is just to stop following the NBA. And so I kind of like stopped a little bit, or at least been following it a bit less than I was before. But it was pretty funny to see that happening.
Yeah, well, what a good story. And how did you get connected with him? Who made the introduction, or did he just reach out?
We got introduced by one of my favorite angels, Brian Pocconi. A lot of people are calling him Coach because he's been fantastic for Hugging Face, especially early stage. He was at SV Angel, who's an investor of us, and he introduced me to Katie. And to Rich Clement, who's his agent, working on a fund called 35 Ventures, which is a fantastic fund. By the way, they've done a lot of really good investments, and that's how we connected and clicked.
What a good story. So, Clem, I think it's obvious to many people, and it's been obvious to you for a long time. AI is having a really big impact everywhere in the world, and just more and more every year. And as I understand it, you also spend quite a bit of time thinking about AI ethics. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, we basically believe that AI and machine learning is already having positive impact today. If you think about how it improves search, it gives access to more knowledge to more people, how it's improving translation, so removing some of the language barriers, how it's like improving moderation, for example, for social platforms that really badly need that. And that there's going to be a lot of other positive use cases that we haven't really figured out, right? And that the community is going to invent, and that the builders using machine learning are going to build. So that's why it's important for us, and that's our mission, to democratize good machine learning. At the same time, we think there are very practical challenges, ethical challenges posed by machine learning. Things like the biases that are present in these models. Things like the presence of PII in private information in data sets or in these models. Things like energy consumption of these models. So it's really important to be very intentional about that, and work and invest time and resources on these topics. That's one of the reasons why we brought in the team. Someone called Dr. Margaret Mitchell was like the co-lead, co-founder and co-lead of the ML ethics team at Google in the past, and who's one of the most recognized researchers on these topics, to work on things like data measurement tool, which is a tool to detect, analyze your data sets, and, for example, find bias in your data set. That's why we've been working a lot on something called model cards, right? Which is the standard way to communicate about limitations, about biases in your models, to make sure that people who are going to use these models will do properly with limiting dual use, for example. We just scratching the surface, but we're really excited about this topic. We think it's a very, very important topic. We think every company working on the field, working on machine learning, should think about how they can build what Dr. Margaret Mitchell calls value-inspired processes when they build machine learning. And that's kind of like the way that we can really all as a field in a very collaborative way, in a very open way, make sure that we steer machine learning towards positive impact for humanity and for the world.
Wow, that's wonderful. And what a wonderful conversation this was, Clem. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks so much for having me.